While I was at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, which has really the premier collection of Asian export art in the world, I worked a great deal on the Asian export holdings and collaborated on exhibitions including Asia in Amsterdam, The Culture of Luxury in the Golden Age, which was open in 2006, and the permanent collection installation Japanimania! Japanese art goes global. And I also worked on several upcoming exhibitions drawn from the Peabody Essex Museum's unrivaled holdings of photography of East Asia, particularly China. PEM's collection is quite unique in the United States. It's part of it. The collection was begun in 1799. It's the oldest continuously operating art museum in the United States, and was founded by sailors and sea captains who, in order to become members of the organization, essentially had to have circumnavigated the globe. And what was unique about the institution is that separated it from other maritime societies up and down the coast of New England was that members were encouraged to bring back objects, what they called natural and artificial curiosities. So because of that, PEM has the distinction of having some of the very first collections of indigenous American art from the Northwest Coast, Chinese art, Japanese art, Korean art, South Asian, Oceanic, and African art, with provenance that dates back to the 18th century and early 19th century. And it's placed in conversation, which it adds another level of dynamism to the presentation. And it's really a collection that disrupts a lot of the binaries that we understand in museums, where we have very distinct departments for individual, oftentimes geographically separate art. There, everything is sort of mixed together and in close proximity. The collection also hopes to disrupt this East and West dichotomy, where we think of those two regions in very monolithic ways. At PEM, curators look at the many ways in which the global East and the global West have been mutually inflected, and how their cultures, while distinct, bear witness to the influence of the other. My interests lie quite a bit in the promotion and sharing of American art, and of course American art is a very tricky term, but looking at the ways in which American art has been presented abroad. One of my interests in grad school was this exhibition of American art in Paris in 1938 that was organized by Alfred at MoMA, and how American art has been presented by curators to foreign audiences. We have our own narratives. American art outside of the American context is not particularly well understood, at least pre-war American art. And these narratives that were perpetuated by such exhibitions have really fundamentally shaped how American art is perceived. I now work at, and for the purposes of this talk, I will, of course, it's ridiculous to try to, in 45 minutes, talk about American or Asian American artistic production with any sort of comprehensive or attempt at a comprehensive narrative. My own interests lie primarily in East Asia, so I've focused on this talk on China and Japan, although there is a much larger history waiting to be written and already beginning to be written, but not perhaps with the same urgency that I feel it should be, on artists of South Asian, Oceanic, etc. extraction. I'm now at the Addison Gallery of American Art, which is a, as the title would imply, Museum of American Art that was founded by Thomas Cochran, who is an alumnus of Phillips Academy Andover and a major banker and college football star and coach, who was not himself an art collector, but saw the strong potential for an art museum to nurture the young men. At that time it was an all-male school, nurture the young men and to provide them with sort of a level of taste that would serve them well as they went on to become the leaders of the world, as many of them did. As our former president, George H.W. Bush, was an alumnus, that kind of the waspiest of the wasps were educated. What was interesting is, in his goal to, quote, enrich permanently the lives of the students, Thomas Cochrane stipulated that the museum's collection is limited to works of art or craftsmanship produced by native-born or naturalized citizens of the United States, with the following exceptions: photographs and books by other than native-born or naturalized citizens, portraits or busts of Americans, and portrayals of American scenes or vessels by artists of foreign birth, produced not later than 1800, and pieces of pottery or glassware of whatever origin or date decorated with American scenes, and scale models of famous ships connected with the history of the United States. So this, Sylvia talked briefly about this kind of colonial revival moment in 1931. You're at the height of this. You're also with the Depression, this really insular look, this rise of nativism, which we're unfortunately experiencing yet again, this mistrust of the cosmopolitan, mistrust of Europe, the other broadly. You have a man now dedicating a museum solely to American production with such rigorous stipulations. He was also particularly obsessive with quality. There was actually at one point in time a decision made that was luckily overturned to only have 100 works in the collection, and those 100 paintings would have to be the best 100 paintings one could assemble. Luckily, that has been relaxed, although they did deaccession a fairly notable Winslow Homer painting in order to keep the quota on track. The founding collection of 50 works assembled by Thomas Cochrane, such as this now considered a masterwork by Winslow Homer, The West Wind, 1891, George Bellows, Anne in a Purple Wrap from 1921, and John Singer Sargent's Val d'Aosta, A Man Fishing, from around 1907, speak to the collecting interest of that time. We've noticed, hopefully, as we've gone through these past three images, this is an exclusively white and exclusively male founding collection, which is not, sadly, unusual. The history of Asian American art has not clearly was not represented in the Addison's collection. And I've decided to use the Addison as a case study as I'm learning this new institution, looking at ways that my own institution can better represent the history of Asian American artistic production, and perhaps by extension serve as some sort of a model for other institutions like the Bigs. This history of an American artistic production is not well understood. And in fact, many of the producers of so-called Asian American art would not likely have identified themselves as Asian Americans, as that phrase was not coined until 1968 with the rise of ethnic studies programs in universities across the United States. We should also be aware, and I will go into this because I believe for myself it's been a major learning lesson having this a learning opportunity having this topic, because I've had to really educate myself in advance of this talk, because there is, as my title would suggest, a major erasure of Asian American artistic production in the museum field broadly. And that is tied, I would argue, very strongly to this notion of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, that if their art did not in some way reference Asian identity, or it didn't fit in Asian departments, it didn't fit in American departments, so it entered into the work by Asian Americans, aside from the very big names like Noguchi, were often stuck in limbo in storage without a curator sort of ambitious enough or interested enough to integrate them into a canon. And I've made that attempt later on, as you'll see. There is, of course, as I should start with, no one Asian American art, just as there is no one African American art, Native American art, or American art broadly. There's no singular art history of any marginalized or minority community, and it's important really to recognize the fact that Asian American art, as these other American arts that I've discussed, defy stylistic categorization. While distinction in printmaking, ink painting, and ceramics might be expected from artists with an interest in reflecting their own Asian heritage, leadership in non-objective painting and sculpture and the developing media photography demonstrates a commitment to contemporary innovative expression. In his foreword to this publication, which was the very first major publication to deal with the history of Asian American artistic production, published only 10 years ago in 2008, Gordon Chang states that Viewers of Asian American art could rarely free themselves from the assumption that art produced by persons who looked, quote, Asian somehow had to express something, quote, Asian. He goes on to say that dominant society marginalized Asians and believed it virtually impossible for them to become acceptable members of American life. Similarly, art produced by them was rarely considered American. At best, their art was constantly subjected to the trope of being a bridge between Eastern and Western art, not taken seriously as they did not conform to a European-American historical lineage. There's also, as I should mention before going into this talk, and which will be brought upon, there is really no other ethnic group that has, as Chinese Americans in particular, that have immigrant populations of the 19th century and beyond that have been subject to such a specificity of legislation, including immigration legislation that limited full citizenship and civil rights, and that sort of history needs to be remembered. The first part of my talk deals a bit with the early connection between China and the United States, which we think of ourselves as operating in a perhaps the first truly global moment, although that is really false, as we have been connected globally for many, many years, as this particular piece would speak to that. China and the U.S. have been inextricably linked since the colonial era. Relations were strengthened at the end of the Revolutionary War as the newly conceived United States, now liberated from the yoke of imperial control, was able to trade with markets once restricted and carefully regulated by the British. This object, of course, from 1710 predates that, but it depicts on porcelain the very first representation of the Americas. This Buddha lion here meant as an incense dispenser. When we look here, you can see the back. And in detail, this design of a native, in quotes, fighting a crocodile is directly modeled from a French print from the 16th century called Killing a Crocodile from India from 1591. So the Americas, as envisioned in this very fanciful, and of course the scale is wild in this engraving, made its way onto to Asian ceramics made for a European clientele. So there are very, very complicated networks of exchange that were happening at this time, where the newly received images of America entered the imagination and created a ravenous market for botanical prints, for porcelains that depicted American animals, American botanical scenes. So this is one example of these very early ties. Another, perhaps more legibly American example can be found with this coffee pot from the commissioned by Elias Haskett Derby, who is a major Salem trader. Chinese goods before the end of the American Revolution were transshipped from Holland or England to the American colonies, and Chinese goods were integral to the interior design schemes of many leading colonial families who ate off of blue and white porcelain and displayed their collections in order to signify their own refined taste and class. You have also American families after the Revolution, adopting traditionally British armorial porcelain schemes in order to attempt to establish the legitimacy of their own status in the new country and sort of bring in a sense of the British gentry to the American colonies. The signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 led the way for American merchants to take the tea trade away from England and to engage very directly with China. On George Washington's birthday on February 22nd, 1784, the Empress of China left New York bound for Guangzhou, which was the center of foreign trade, and arrived in Whampoa, which was one of the entrepôts you had to arrive at before being able to gain access to Canton, as it was called, now Guangzhou. And in August of that year, which they arrived in 1784, and then returned to New York on May 1st of the next year with teas, silks, and 136 chests filled with porcelain. That same year, Elias Haskett Derby, who commissioned this coffee pot, his ship, the Grand Turk, became the first to embark from Salem to reach Guangzhou directly. This is a punch bowl that depicts the Grand Turk celebrating its journey. You can also see the American flag. Derby himself received a private order of monogram porcelain, a 171-piece dining set, and a 101-piece tea service, both bearing his initials and a design of hope. You also see Chinese goods becoming Americanized through the addition of various signia, including the Great Seal of the United States, which we'll see on the next slide, and the Society of the Cincinnati. This is a very, very famous set that was commissioned for the Society of Cincinnati, which was founded by General Henry Knox, and was a sort of a fraternal organization that surprisingly still exists today, originally formed by veterans of the Revolutionary War. Here we have a later cup and saucer from the turn of the 18th century with the Great Seal of the United States. So this is a distinctively Chinese object that bears direct American design inspiration and was produced for an American audience. And I think that in many ways complicates our definition of what is and what can be American. You also notice portraiture coming out of China. This is by the most famous Chinese export painter, Spoilum, who was really the father of export painting. This is a picture of Captain William Story, who was a founding member of the East India Marine Society, which was the founding organization of the Peabody Essex Museum, painted in 1804. And if you did not see the fact that it was done by Spoilum, you might suggest that this was an early colonial portrait painted in a quote-unquote naive or folk style. You have this flattening of the picture plane, very stylized depiction. You also have later on far more sort of American-inspired or European Western art historical-inspired depictions. This is a view of the Hongs at Canton from the Peabody Essex Museum collection from 1825. You can see the American flag flying above. Again, this is by a Chinese artist, Lam Qua, but you would, at first glance, assume this to be by an American or European artist. And I think that's part of the some of the lasting concerns that people have with Asian art, and particularly Asian American art, is that if it doesn't look like something that we would consider Asian, where does it fit? This is also a particularly disturbing work, but one of my favorites, by Lam Qua. This was a portrait of Wu Pun, luckily we are able to identify many of these subjects. But he was a patient of Dr. Peter Parker, not Spider-Man, but a different Peter Parker who had a very early clinic in China and treated men and women suffering from, as you can see here, enlarged tumors. The bulk of paintings that were done by Lam Qua, and they were meant to demonstrate Peter Parker's prowess. You have before and after. Most of the afters are missing, but you have these before images. They were used as Parker toured around Europe and the United States to raise money for his own clinic. He was also a missionary. The bulk of these reside at Yale University, where they're still used today, actually, with medical school classes, because the ability to see such a developed tumor of this kind, benign tumor, is really impossible to see in the developed world. So these are important medical documents. You also have figures of the Chinese. This is a collaborative work done by Samuel McIntyre, Cornet, and Jonathan Bright, figure of a Mandarin Chinese from 1801, a mixed media work in the Peabody Essex Museum collection. So not only was Asian art being consumed by Americans, you also had Americans trying to bring these sort of avatars of Chinese people into a museum context in order to explore or to more or less to illustrate the types of people that they would have dealt with while on their journeys as they were away for months at a time without contact with their families. You also have a great deal of work has been done on this topic, but the integration of blue and white porcelain into American works of art. Here we have a very whimsical Audubon illustration of the common mouse from quadrupeds of North America with this blue and white Chinese jar. By the 1840s, what was once a rarefied and very much sort of distinct type of art that was limited along class lines to those who could afford such a luxury good was exported in mass and was very accessible to the common man. On a parallel track, you have this consumption of Japanese goods. The history of Japanese and American exchange is equally complicated. The Chinese were very restrictive as to who could trade. There were, for example, no women allowed off of American ships or European ships into Canton. Only very hand-selected supercargoes and sea captains were allowed to step foot in Canton. Also, while they were there, they were carefully monitored and under the control of a Hong merchant assigned to them. An even more restrictive type of trade relationship was enacted in Japan. This is a very early and quite fascinating tray from the early 19th century that was commissioned by American sailors who were enlisted by the Dutch, who for many years had monopoly over the Japanese trade. The Dutch being a Protestant country where they cared more so about profit than they did about converting the Japanese, and did not cause the same problems that the Portuguese had caused in terms of trying to proselytize and convert Japanese citizens into Christians. The Dutch were more or less just interested in their in the VOC. Their trading arm in the East was really interested in profit. They, for a brief time, were involved in various continental wars and decided to enlist the help of the United States in sending ships to take care of the Dutch yearly trip to Japan. Flying the Dutch flag, American sailors from Salem actually landed in Nagasaki. This is Deshima, which is a fan-shaped man-made island that is accessible only by this one bridge. And all of the trade that happened between Japan and the world at large before Perry's breaking open of Japan through gunboat diplomacy was conducted on this tiny, tiny island with sharpened bamboo spikes on the edge of the wall to dissuade anyone from thinking that they could go anywhere other than where they were specifically allowed to go. PEM also has this remarkable tray that bears the Great Seal of the United States in the center. This is not indicative of the traditional high quality of Japanese lacquer, because the Japanese very early and very quickly figured out that these Americans were not Dutch, even though they were flying the Dutch flag, and knew that an opportunity like this would not come around for much longer. So the Americans commissioned large numbers of Asian lacquer pieces, and this design was actually adapted from the customs ledger of a ship, the Margaret, that sailed to Japan. So the Japanese knew they had to rush production because the Americans were not going to come for quite some time after then. PEM is very fortunate to have what is perhaps the first photographic image of a Japanese person, a portrait of Sentaro. The Japanese, as you can tell in the previous slides, were very protective over their cultural identity and very wary of foreign influence. So sailors, for example, it was considered treasonous that if one was shipwrecked to be rescued by anyone other than a Japanese crew. Sentaro was in fact rescued by an American whaler. He was a cook aboard a Japanese fishing ship that drifted far offshore, and he was brought to San Francisco, where this Baltimore daguerreotypist Harvey Marks took his portrait, and this was widely reproduced because up until then, the accounts of Japanese people were few and far between, And he was truly the very first Japanese person to be photographed in the United States. And also photographic technology was very slow to come to Japan. Then you have, of course, the forced opening of Japan to the West by Commodore Perry with his famous gunboat diplomacy. This being a Japanese woodblock print that is in the traditional Japanese woodblock print aesthetic that depicts Commodore Perry, and it's called Portrait of Perry, a North American. You also see around the 1860s the beginning of diplomatic relations with the signing of a forced treaty with the Japanese. You have the beginnings of a more formal diplomatic relationship. This is a medal that's in the Addison's collection that commemorates the first embassy from Japan in 1860. And here is a photograph of the first embassy from Japan with U.S. government representatives. The proliferation of Asian taste and interest in particularly Japanese works of art was further cemented through the presentation and very politically motivated presentation of Japanese goods at both the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876 and the World's Columbian Exhibition in 1893 in Chicago. The Japanese, following the Meiji Restoration, where the traditional samurai culture was overthrown, and a major push at industrialization and modernization was begun, the Japanese believed that they could make a major splash on the market, increase their economic output, and modernize their country and compete with the West, as they had been shamed by the West and forced into this unfair, one-sided treaty. They wanted to regain power and to restore honor to their culture, and in order to do so, sent thousands of meticulously crafted decorative arts objects to the United States and abroad in order to display the technical prowess and artistic mastery of the Japanese. And this just led to a craze for all things Japanese that would be felt throughout the 19th century into the 20th century, and really to today. The show that I worked on at PEM traces that history from very early works by Portuguese, Namban, which is a phrase that describes a body of work, Namban meaning the art of the southern barbarians, work that was produced by Japan for a Portuguese market, everything from 16th century to a 1980s Hello Kitty telephone. So that long preamble leads me, because I think it's important to understand the history, as it's not a history that is well understood in the United States, which is part of the sort of thesis of my talk, that this is a major lacuna or absence in our own understanding of ourselves as a nation, and particularly in our artwork. The story of Asian immigration to the United States, unlike the stories that we're used to hearing about immigration, in which we have immigrants landing in Eastern centers and expanding west, this story is the inverse, where we have large groups over time of Asian immigrants landing in the West and making their way east. So it's a really interesting and new way to think of immigration, and one that we're not as familiar with telling. The first Chinese people in the first of the three major, what scholars consider the three major waves of immigration, began arriving in 1815, and they were mainly men. This is a later print, but perhaps illustrates the conditions that were found on the various steamships that Asian nationals took to the West Coast in search of work, as they had certain experience, particularly in the Guangzhou or Canton region, with Americans. They knew of the promise of America and wanted to explore that in greater depth, and thus left. And most of the early Asian Americans were originally from southern China, the Guangzhou Canton region, as they had the most developed trade relations with America. In 1834, Aifong Moy became the first female Chinese immigrant, and I should mention that almost exclusively men were allowed to immigrate to the United States. That would have long-lasting repercussions in terms of the development of family units and social structure in Chinese American households and societies. Aifong Moy in 1834 became the first female Chinese immigrant to the United States. She was brought to New York City from her home of Guangzhou by Nathaniel and Frederick Karn, who exhibited her as, quote, the Chinese lady. She arrived on the steamship Washington in New York City, and 3 weeks later, after her arrival, she was put on display as part of an exhibit called the Chinese Saloon. And for 50 cents, New Yorkers could purchase a ticket to see her in this room full of Chinese-inspired objects. She sat from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and then 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. daily, performing from the crowds by using chopsticks and speaking in Chinese. And she eventually toured up and down the East Coast, and by 1848, she was performing as part of a P.T. Barnum show. As her popularity waned, she was replaced in 1850. And all that remains of her is a black and white drawing of her performance that appeared in a newspaper. So again, we have this exploitation of otherness, Chinese being viewed as a peculiar peculiarity, something to be used as entertainment. And that was in large part due to the scarcity of Chinese immigrants at this time. By 1848, there were 325 Chinese Americans in the entire United States. And that would grow exponentially, so that in 1852, there were 20,000, 2,000 coming each day after that point. By 1852, we have 25,000, and then by 1880, 300,000 Chinese Americans in the United States, and a tenth of the Californian population as well, mostly from 6 districts of Canton. And the reason that such a mass immigration of Chinese Americans occurred is tied to the gold rush. As California discovered their vast resources of gold, cheap Chinese labor was brought in, and there were, in the late 1850s, 15,000 Chinese mine workers in the Gold Mountains or Mountains of Gold in California. There they were subject to really unspeakable atrocities, frequently robbed by European American counterparts, subject to violent attacks, often murdered without any sort of punishment for the perpetrators. And a lot of that has to do with the very fact that from the beginning, Chinese Americans did not have a path towards citizenship. The entry of the Chinese into the United States was to begin with legal and uncomplicated, with the signing of the Burlingame Treaty between the United States and China. But that came with a stipulation, and that was that the difference between Chinese immigrants and European immigrants was that if Chinese migrants had children born in the United States, those children would automatically acquire American citizenship. However, the immigrants themselves would remain as foreigners indefinitely. Unlike European immigrants, there was no possibility of naturalization. Chinese people band together in order to protect themselves from attack, and came into this really toxic, racist culture, where they were really prevented from assimilation due to virulent racism, also a strong language barrier, and a lack of a desire on the part of European Americans to aid in any way their transition from Asia to the United States. There was also, it should be noted, a special foreign miners tax aimed at the Chinese that was passed in 1852 by the California legislature. Since they were ineligible for citizenship, and at that time constituted the largest percentage of non-white population in California, this tax was almost exclusively aimed at the Chinese and required a payment of $3 each month at a time when Chinese miners were making approximately $6 a month. Tax collectors could legally take and sell the property of those minors who refused or could not pay the tax. And fake tax collectors continued to make money by extorting Chinese immigrants who did not speak the language or did not have the money. You also have the complication of the position of gold miners with the people of the state of California versus George H. Hall, which was a decision in 1854 that the Chinese were not allowed to testify as witnesses before the court in California against white citizens, including those accused of murder. And the decision states that a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point, as their history has shown, differing in language, opinions, color, and physical conformation, between whom and ourselves nature has placed an impassable difference. They had no right to swear away the life of a citizen or participate with us in administering the affairs of our government. The second wave of Chinese immigration tied to industry came with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. There was a major lack of white Anglo-American construction workers, and in 1865, a large number of Chinese workers were recruited from the silver mines in California, as well as later contract workers from China. And that came from an idea of Charles Crocker, who was the manager of the Central Pacific Railroad, who believed that the, quote, weedy, slender-looking Chinese workers, who were known as Crocker's pets, were suitable for the heavy physical work entailed in building the railroad. And because these Chinese men, who were paid significantly less than their Euro-American counterparts, were forced to do, and this, of course, sounds trite in our contemporary world, first to do the work that no white American wanted to do. And because of that, died in great numbers and were forced to do backbreaking and quite dangerous labor. The Central Pacific Tract was constructed primarily by Chinese immigrants. Even though they were considered to be too weak or fragile to do this kind of work initially, the decision was made after the Chinese proved themselves to be capable and skilled workers to give Chinese the responsibilities, as I mentioned earlier, that European Americans did not want to undertake. This iconic image of the joining of the rails at Promontory Point in 1869, taken by Andrew J. Russell, features nearly 100 white men carefully arranged around two black steam engines. You have the railroad baron Leland Stanford, who commissioned the shot to commemorate the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. There are two white engineers positioned in the very center, shaking hands, but you'd see none of the 13,000 Chinese workers who had made up the majority of the workforce on the Central Pacific Line. So again, this very deliberate erasure of Asian American identity, history, and importance in the photographic medium, with this iconic image that for, I think, most of us taking American history, we know this image, but not with the same level of recognition as we know images that actually depict Chinese workers building the railroad, which, of course, is this major sign of American industrialization, bringing in a new era of connection between the East and West coasts. So the flow of immigration was seen as very threatening to Americans of European descent. The immigration that was encouraged by the Burlingame Treaty of 1868 was stopped by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1862, which outlawed all Chinese immigration to the United States and denied citizenship to those already settled in the country. It was renewed in 1892 and extended indefinitely in 1902, with when the Chinese, and because of that, the Chinese population declined in a major sense until the act was repealed in 1943 by the Magnuson Act, following the allied status of the Chinese and the Americans during the Second World War. In 1888, U.S. President Grover Cleveland, who supported the Chinese Exclusion Act, proclaimed the Chinese as, quote, an element ignorant of our Constitution and laws, impossible of assimilation with our people, and dangerous to our peace and welfare. Here you have Thomas Nast, a critical cartoon of the Chinese question, with this personification of America being harangued by this angry mob, protecting this Chinese immigrant who is almost about to be taken by this potentially lynch mob. Many Western states also made it difficult for Chinese and Japanese immigrants to own land and find work. Some of the anti-Chinese laws included the foreign miners license tax, which I mentioned as well. And this, of course, all dates back to some of the original sins of the United States as articulated in the Naturalization Act of 1790 that reserved naturalized citizenship to, quote, free white persons. Again, you see people critical, artists critical of the Chinese Exclusion Act beginning to express in this image some of the hypocrisy of the United States, where the United States would allow communists, nihilist socialists, Fenian and Hoodlum welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. Again, popular sentiment tied to Chinese, the barring of Chinese immigration, hip hooray, Chinese excluded, as particularly blue-collar Americans saw the threat of Chinese as a major threat to their way of life, which, of course, unfortunately is quite familiar in our day and age. Here we have the Chinese women in an internment on Angel Island off the coast of San Francisco, where thousands of Chinese immigrants were warehoused before being deported to China during this time. And this is a monument that has come up over the past 100 years or so to recognize those Chinese immigrants who, in search of a better life, were turned away by the United States. And for those Americans or Chinese Americans who immigrated to the United States and remained in the United States, the Chinatown model was the preferred model for forming societies. In order, as they were faced with really unspeakable cruelty, including several racially motivated murders, hate crimes, etc., Chinese immigrants found sanctuary in ethnically homogenous communities like Chinatowns that sprung up in major U.S. cities, notably San Francisco, New York, where Chinese people felt protected and were able to practice their own cultural beliefs in relative safety and security. The Japanese immigration was a bit more complicated, as it didn't begin until the late 1860s, as the opening of Japan became more regulated. You also have continued legislation to specifically exclude ethnic groups, ethnically Japanese groups in this case. And most famously, Asian Americans who ventured into the United States were forced into internment camps. Large numbers began migrating to the United States following the Meiji Restoration, and the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 between the governments of Japan and U.S. ended the immigration of Japanese unskilled workers, but permitted the immigration of businessmen, students, and spouses. The Immigration Act of 1924, which this celebrates, banned the immigration of nearly all Japanese. Because no new immigration, all Japanese Americans born after 1924 were by definition born in the United States. And so the fact that so many naturally born United States citizens were rounded up and sent to internment camps during the Second World War, and an estimated 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals from the west coast of the United States were, notably they were not in Hawaii, were forcibly interned in 10 different camps across the western interior of the country. This series by Ansel Adams, which is problematic in its own right, as it presents sort of a rosy colored portrait of Japanese life in internment camps, while also erasing sort of any sort of hint of indigenous Japanese identity, depicts in the collection of the Addison Gallery, shows the conditions under which American citizens were forced to reside due to their ethnic origin. So, of course, I've gone way over time already, well, almost over time. So I will try to go through this a little bit more rapidly. We have a very well-trod history of American artists inspired by Japan. I've selected examples from my own collection at the Addison Gallery, including John Lafarge, who is a prolific scholar of Japanese art, who traveled quite extensively throughout Japan. You have artists like John Singer Sargent in this fairly recently attributed painting, The Blue Bowl, this very sketchy sort of loose brushwork, this woman holding onto a blue and white Chinese planter or bowl on this surface. You have artists who less directly engaged with Asian art, but were nonetheless inspired by Asian aesthetics, such as strong contours. In this case, we have this sort of cropped, intimate view, which you see a great deal in Asian compositions. Also, strong sense of asymmetry. You have photographers who were inspired by Asian objects in creating these Orientalist compositions that were desirous, which were appealed to a desire of European Americans to collect and decorate their homes with so-called exotic objects. Again, in photography, you have not just the very blatant examples of appropriation of Asian motifs. You have artists like Alvin Langdon Coburn, the pictorialist photographer, who's very interested in capturing Asian aesthetics in his photography with this cropped view of a bridge, with the strong verticals, this sort of misty, almost ink painting-like composition. Edward Steichen's Moonlight, again inspired by the sort of haziness of Chinese ink brush painting. Arnold Genthe, the famous German-American pictorialist photographer, traveled through China, produced this image, The Descent from Mount Fuji, which not only is photographed in a very Asian-inspired style, but depicts an Asian scene. And you have works by artists like Robert Reed, who went really full-out chinoiserie, full-out Orientalism, with this Girl with Chinese Vase of 1915 in the collection of the Addison Gallery. None other artist really asserted the importance of Japanese aesthetics quite like Arthur Wesley Dow. We have his portrait here and his book Composition, which was taught in nearly every art and design school and is still used as a teaching tool today in art schools. He was very interested in Japanese aesthetics, as you can tell by this particular work. He was appointed assistant curator of the Japanese collection at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Boston being a major repository of Japanese art and the center of the study of Japanese art. He later gave a lecture organizing his ideas on Japanese art, which became the basis for his popular teaching model entitled Composition. Here are some cyanotypes in our collection of work that Dow encountered during his travels. You see the very strong contour lines, color blocking, familiar, evocative of woodblock prints, and a series of Ipswich prints where he very deliberately appropriates Asian motifs and casts them as American. Again, you can see his repetition of American themes through the lens of a Japanese-inspired aesthetic idiom. His most famous student, or one of his most famous students, George O'Keeffe, really absorbed one of his main areas of interest, which is a term called notan, which is the ideal type of study for finding the shapes and patterns that serve as the foundation of every composition. And it's appropriated from a Japanese word that means light-dark balance, which I think is really on full view in this charcoal on paper abstract drawing in our collection by George O'Keeffe. So this is, again, we'll rush through my attempt, my very naive attempt here to mine my own collection at the Addison Gallery for works by Asian American artists. And I would say that except for a very few of these works from our collection by Asian Americans, these works have not been on view either ever or have not been on view since the 1960s, so 50 years or so. We have, for example, a work by Noguchi, perhaps the most famous Asian American artist, a major modernist Japanese American sculptor. We have a 1931 standing nude. again, does not immediately scream Asian, and thus, because his work, while referencing Asian traditions, does not present sort of extreme difficulties for a European modernist this audience that was instilled with the tenets of European modernism was not particularly difficult to grasp onto his work. You have Japanese photographers photographing some of the greatest figures of modernism, including Martha Graham, the famous choreographer. This beautiful print in our collection by Soichi Tsunami. You have also Yasuo Kuniyoshi, who is one of the most famous Asian American artists, who only fairly recently received a major retrospective at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. He was also particularly well-known popularly, and unfortunately served as the inspiration for Mickey Rooney's notoriously racist character, Mr. Uniyoshi, in Breakfast at Tiffany's. So Asian American artists were very much popular in their time, and it's really within the last 50 years that they've been forgotten and relegated to the margins of history. A lot of that, I would argue, relating to the racist views in which most Americans of their time perceived them. We have artists like Arthur Dove, very inspired by quote-unquote Eastern philosophy, also by ink painting. Jackson Pollock, of course, directly inspired by Chinese ink painting with his very active compositions, but pairing that work or thinking about that work in connection with a work by an Asian American printmaker in our collection that has never been on view, called Early Passion, that contains some of the similar sort of brushwork, active, very gestural compositions. So while not explicitly of an Asian subject matter, you can see that we like to think of Asian American art as separate, but was fully integrated into the major artistic movements of the 20th century. Perhaps the most famous, or one of the most famous, but more or less forgotten in today's world, painters Dong Kingman was considered to be, in fact, America's favorite watercolorist. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1942, which enabled him to paint throughout the United States. He was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1944, but Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a great fan of his, arranged for his transfer to the OSS Art Department, where he drew maps. He had a major exhibition of his work at the De Young Museum in 1945, and despite this critical acclaim, he was continued to be referred to in Time magazine in the 1940s as bouncy, buck-toothed little Dong Kingman. He himself stated that he felt that Western painters call me Chinese. Chinese painters say I'm very Western. I would say I'm in the middle. Also, he stated, everyone writes that my work is half East and half West, and that I'm in between. I don't know. I just want to be myself. And I think that speaks to the pressure that many Asian American artists felt and have felt between this expectation on the part of a Euro-American art establishment to see Asian influence in their work, where they just wanted to express their own identity. Here he is on the cover of American Artists, which, if that's not a ringing endorsement for a more integrated point of view when approaching this material, I don't know what is. He was also a juror for 20 consecutive years for the televised Miss Universe pageant, which was something that I found just remarkable. So a pop culture figure, but how many among us have heard of Dong Kingman? Very few. I should note, and not to pat my own back, but I will, I'm including this particular work, which has never been seen at, or maybe it was seen in the 1940s, at the Addison Gallery in an upcoming show that opens this winter because of this talk. You also see sculpture being produced by Asian Americans. This is a work in our collection that I think resonates quite deeply with our David Smith structures of arches from 1939. Again, this interest in form, shape, jutting compositions. We have significant holdings of Reuben Tam, who is a Hawaiian-born Chinese-American artist, interested in abstract expressionism, and his work clearly in dialogue with the better known exclusively white abstract expressionists of his time. You have artists like Mark Tobey, who were very interested in Japan. He, in fact, traveled to Japan and painted this watercolor study in Tokyo, but took calligraphy as a jumping off point for his own work, and his famous white writing, a work in our collection that resembles Chinese calligraphy. You have artists like Ruth Asawa, who's received a critical re-examination and resurgence, only died a few years ago, best known for her sort of amorphous, biomorphic sculptures composed of light materials like wire. She also started as a painter, working in the same circle as Jackson Pollock, Rothko, the luminaries of abstract expressionism. You have African-American artists, including Norman Lewis, who were particularly interested in Asian aesthetics. So you have this equal exchange of East and West in this selection. Norman Lewis being inspired by, again, Japanese, Chinese painting traditions to create New Moon of 1951. Carl Zerbe, the immigrant artist, painted this really just spectacular view of Chinatown, which will also be in the show that I'm working on, Chinatown No. 2 in 1952, that depicts with respect that is lacking in a lot of other depictions of Chinatown, the dynamism and energy of this place. You have artists like Yutaka Ohashi, almost unknown artists, who were working in ways that synthesized Western and Asian traditions. You have gold leaf, which is a traditional medium used in Japanese screens and painting, creating a composition that almost looks like a Motherwell painting, but with this addition of a truly Japanese design. Again, another really beautiful Ruben Tam. He spent time in very different areas. He was linked to Hawaii, but also spent a significant amount of time on Monhegan Island in Maine, which is really the cradle of the American regionalism. You have artists like Agnes Martin, herself Canadian born but settled in New Mexico, inspired by Asian philosophy and the sort of delicate lines that you see in a great deal of Asian art. You have Toshiko Takaizu working in stoneware, popularizing Japanese aesthetics in stoneware in the 1960s. A great deal of her work can be found in collections, but she's often contextualized within ceramics or placed in Asian art galleries and not within the larger American art scene that she was working within. We have a kinetic sculpture by Wen Ying Tsai that has never been on view, even though it's been in the collection for over 50 years. We also have photography by Asian Americans, Eiko Hosoe, Japanese American who's still living, and also combining several elements of this talk. We have a work that touches upon disability studies, queer studies, Latin American studies, and Asian studies. This magnificent painting by Martin Wong, portrait of Miguel Pinheiro, his long-term friend and partner, who is a Latin American poet, from 1982, that combines some of Martin Wong's signature sign language painting, which actually relates to, which is the distillation of a poem that Pinheiro wrote, but also speaks, I think, to sort of the alienation and loneliness of the immigrant experience in New York, but a beautiful monumental work. And Martin Wong is, as evidenced by a recent show at the Bronx Museum, receiving a great deal of critical attention. We've also really started to focus our own collecting on work by Asian American contemporary artists. It's not an easy, I think there's no easy solution to this historical imbalance or absence, as we've discussed throughout the day. But I think subtle steps can be taken that are that really don't require much effort on the part of curators. It is a lot of effort to mine the collection, but not a financial, necessarily a great financial expense, but really to look critically at collections and explore those works that have languished in storage for years because they don't fit into canons that were previously established. I myself found this to be a really eye-opening and incredible experience to search critically for work and bring work to light that my colleagues, some of whom have been there for nearly 30 years, have never seen. And we have a collection of 19,000 objects, so nothing like the Mets where things can easily sort of be lost, or like Peabody Essex with 1.8 million objects. These objects really deserve to be seen in a context that breaks down these rigid hierarchies and divisions. And I thank you very much.